going on out here. There's a lot of smoke out here. Well, good evening. My name is Jessie Willie Wilson. I'm CEO and president of Dreambox Learning. And when Deborah Quazzo asked me to introduce Reed Hastings, I said, great, it would be an honor. And then I thought about it, and I said, how do you introduce somebody, especially here, that everybody already knows? Maybe some of you have even seen him speak here a few times, and those who don't know him know of him. And I thought, wow, what do I say? So I'm going to use some notes, if you don't mind. Most of you might know him as an education reform philanthropist, a technology innovator, and chairman and CEO of Netflix, a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise that most of us have intimate relationships with at home. I think the only thing my dear husband, Dave, isn't 100% honest with me about is when he cheats on viewing episodes of Netflix's Dear White People or 7 Seconds when I'm away from home or traveling for work. Netflix is testing marriages. When I think of Reed Hastings, I think of a values-based leader who was an early investor in Dreambox Learning. When it was not much of a company, it was more of an idea. And it was at a time when no one, even folks here in this setting, understood what intelligent, adaptive technology was or could do in their learning environment. It was just an idea. Reed saw our promise, and when things were challenging, he helped us see past impediments toward possibilities. He helped me, as a leader, keep the long run in clear sight, and he encouraged me, prodded me sometimes, to intentionally cultivate a culture that would attract the best hearts and the best minds to this work. When I think of Reed Hastings, I think of an exceptional humanitarian who spent some of his early formative years in Africa in the Peace Corps and who knows firsthand what it means to be the other. When I think of Reed Hastings, I think of somebody who really taught me the importance of compassionate leadership, of authentic leadership, and of courageous leadership. And when I say courageous, I mean saying when you make a mistake, owning it, and letting others understand that that's part of learning. There would be no Dreambox if we didn't have mistakes to analyze, yet we haven't really figured out a way, even in the most innovative companies, to encourage people to learn from mistakes. So I could tell you many, many stories about this amazing human being, but you really came to hear from Reed. So please join me in welcoming Reed Hastings.
How many people here have seen Richard Madden in The Bodyguard? Medium, okay. Natasha Lyonne in Russian Doll? Yeah, a little more for that. How about Kevin Costner in Highwayman? A little bit. Okay, I would say this audience needs some remedial education when it comes to the fun of life. You're also serious capitalists serving the general good. Well, I'm going to spend a few of my minutes as a citizen talking about education, and then a few as CEO talking about entertainment and the incredible journey we've had. So first, as a citizen, I first fell in love with Roy Romer. He was superintendent in Los Angeles, former governor of Colorado, and head of the Democratic Governors Association, so a very sophisticated politician. He came in 2000 with a great plan. Many of us rallied around him and funded his work. And he did some great stuff, regional superintendents, each one with about 80 schools of Los Angeles, is then 700, so that they could really be close to picking the principals. He put in formative assessment, teacher training and leadership, all of the key building blocks of building an excellent district. And slowly the scores and the reading and the math, everything was coming together. But after 6 years, he no longer had 4 votes out of 7 on his school board. He was gone. New guy comes in. Guess what this new school board had run on? What does any politician run on? Change. So his programs were out. New guy's programs were in. Scores regressed to the norm. So I puzzled on this lesson, which was heartbreaking, not only for me as a philanthropist, but for the kids and for overall progress in LAUSD. And I started learning more about, the roots of public education. And lo and behold, we were not the first generation to try to improve our public schools. And you go back 1892, about 125 years ago, and there was the Committee of 10. And the Committee of 10, led by Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard University, this august group to set out the high school curriculum and on. These commissions come every 10, 20 years, nation at risk. All these things happen, and not a lot changes. And so I started wondering, what is it that's really, I know, it's funding. The funding's so inequitable. The funding is so low. If we can just fix the funding, then in fact we can have the great American public education that we want, where every kid gets an opportunity for an excellent education. But then you look and you see, there's a number of cities in the Northeast funded at over $20,000 a student, Newark, Camden, many others. And their results are not spectacular. And then there's some of the low-funded states like Utah with quite solid results. And in fact, there's a very thin, if any, correlation so far between the funding level. And so, while I believe in more funding and I've worked for more funding, that's clearly not the panacea. Oh, it's unions! Everybody knows unions are the problem. Well, if unions were the problem, then the Deep South would have amazing schools, and the Northeast, like Massachusetts, would have terrible schools. But in fact, it's the opposite. If you actually believe in data, you would say unions help schools. So it's not really the unions. Tenure, that's the problem. Everybody knows what a ridiculous institution tenure is. If we just fix tenure, then we're going to have the greatest public schools in the world. But universities have tenure, and they do okay. And law firms have tenure, and they do okay. And some states have very minimal tenure, and they don't do any better. So it's not tenure. Accountability. That's the problem. We don't have enough accountability. Let's get some test scores, and let's find out the low-performing schools, and let's find out where there's big gaps, and let's hold those schools accountable. Let's close the school. Oh, we can't do that. The kids need to go to some schools, so we can't close it. Let's give them more money. Oh, that's the new kind of accountability. So the whole accountability movement doesn't really work, because when a school's in trouble, we can't really close it, so we give it more money and resources. And the reward financially is at least if you have low performance. Accountability is not much of a winner there. Leadership. Oh, yeah, maybe. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Roy Romer was not an anomaly. In fact, if you look over the last 30 years, there have been 12 superintendents in LA Unified. You got a couple 100,000 employees at schools, as you know. It's a service business. You got to manage, recruit, motivate, develop thousands of teachers to do well for kids. It's a large-scale service business. Many of you have run those. And you got to have steady discipline. You got to have systems. And I thought, wow, what if this average school superintendent lasted 3 years? Well, of course, that's what's true, not only in LA Unified, in our large urban school districts in America for the last 50 years, The average tenure of a superintendent is 3 years. And I thought, wow, imagine if all the organizations that the people in this room ran had a new CEO every 3 years. Jessie's been doing her job for 10 years, and she's building momentum, just getting started. I've been doing mine for 21, just getting started. And in fact, those long runs is when you really make progress because you can develop all the supporting systems around. So why in school districts, at least large school districts, do we have rapid turnover? Well, that's because you run on change as a politician, and the school boards are elected publicly. And when there's a new majority, they want to change things. And so this cycle of new people elected to a school board, change superintendent, and change direction. It's not enough to, bring in a new superintendent to do the same things as the last guy. That doesn't make sense. So you got to have a new theory of change. And that flip-flopping from the old theory to the new theory is at the root of the problem. So why don't you see that in a suburban community? In a suburban community, generally, you've got a homogeneous electorate and low electoral intensity. If you measure an election by how much money people spend to get elected to school board, the low intensity, it becomes very genial, and you do continue the methods of the past because it hasn't been a hard-fought election. In LA Unified, with these short tenures, a school board election raises $2 million now for a school board. So the higher the electoral intensity, the more draw for change, the faster the superintendent's turnover, and the more chaotic and just sort of limping along the system is. So we're trapped in this cycle where good people try to run for school board, they mean well, they change the superintendent, they believe in the new direction, as well as in 3 years, the next person believes in that new change again. And so if you think about it, if we're going to continue to have superintendents change every 3 years, there is no way for our large urban districts to find a direction and steadily work at it to improve teacher effectiveness year after year after year, which is a steady, disciplined business. So what are we going to do about it? Well, that's where nonprofit governance comes in. So most of you are in either for-profits or nonprofits, and they work very similarly. How do you recruit new board members? Where you look for someone who's independent, a good thinker, will challenge you some, but also believes in the general direction that you're doing. That's called a self-perpetuating board. Now, what happens with a self-perpetuating board is you got on the board to continue to make the organization a little bit healthier. Sometimes you change leaders, but you change on the same direction. You're not changing to let's go in a whole new direction because you didn't have to fight to get elected. Now, it turns out that self-perpetuating governance is a long understood form of governance. The Pope chooses the cardinals choose the Pope. Okay? And you can say, well, look where that's got the Catholic Church. But that's very temporary. They're in a setback right now, okay? But they've seen much worse than this, and it's 2,000 years that they've been running. So you got to give them a lot of credit. It's an impressive organizational structure, okay? So this cycle is for-profits, nonprofits. Now think about the military branches. The generals pick the new generals, okay? It's a self-perpetuating form of governance. So this self-perpetuating, abstract thing called governance is actually critically important. So I've been on the board of KIPP Charter Schools for a little over a decade. We've had a great CEO, Richard Barth. Eventually, we'll replace him, and we'll replace him with someone who's following the same ethos. He's been very successful. KIPP now is over 200 schools, 100,000 kids getting a great education every day. And the advantages with nonprofit governance, we're bringing on new people that can help KIPP get even better without the electoral context. So this is why I'm so passionate about the importance of nonprofit governance, and the way to evolve there is to grow the charter movement year by year by year. Now, well, thank you. Thank you for the charter movement, but we are having some setbacks. A large number of the new Democratic electorate believes in Medicare for all. So Medicare for all is we're going to close all the health insurers. Those nonprofit Blue Cross guys, awful. Okay, the for-profits, awful. We're going to close all those, and the government's going to run the entire system. And this has the grip, the emotional grip of large parts of the Democratic base. So there's been a big shift towards government over corporations. That's a nonprofit. It's still got the word corporation in it. Okay, so this is a significant trend that's affecting, obviously, the healthcare debate. And in blue states, it's affecting charter schools. And the tide for now is turned against them. So we're fighting to hold on. You know, some states we will. Some states there'll be setbacks. Massachusetts, we can't get rid of the cap. We may have some other states. Interestingly, in red states, they've rolled out the red carpet. The charter movement's progressing. And so we're making great progress for America, but in a relatively concentrated set of states. So we'll see where that evolves, but what I wanted to do is walk through with you this theory of governance is why it enables the conditions. And so it's not that every nonprofit or every charter school is going to be great. We know of many that don't work very well. But the great ones can get better and better every year. What I have seen in my 10 years at KIPP is how much better they are now at 200 schools than when I joined the board at 30 schools. Because as they get bigger, they've been able to do more R&D, more professional development, more thoughtful curriculum, all the things that you get in the benefits of scale. And again, it's long-term, stable leadership that's essential. I know the charter path looks hard. It looks like a long challenge to change American public education. But there's not a shorter path that we know of. If we could fix the schools we have, for sure, that is the best way. But when we look at the 3-year turnover that's been the past 50 years and will be the next 50 years of our large school districts, then under a system that turns over those school districts, we're not going to see any tremendous change. That turns over the superintendents. That's the fundamental root cause of the wobble and the lack of execution, despite many, many great people who work in school districts. Those same people who work in school districts, if they worked in a stable, well-run nonprofit, they would contribute at enormous levels and steadily grow and improve what this is about. Now, it may seem like a long journey, but people change slowly. If you think about simple things like one person, one vote, pretty obvious idea, right? You know, Locke and all those people in the 1500s were muttering about that, one person, one vote, and didn't really get very far until the American Revolution. And suddenly, in one time, boom, we had it. Democracy. It was only landed white males who could vote. And it took our country 50 more years until Andrew Jackson to allow poor, unlanded white males to vote. And then another 50 years to the Civil War for African American men nominally to be able to vote. And then another 50 years until the 16th Amendment to allow women to vote. And then another 50 years for civil rights and African Americans to be able to vote in practice. So a very simple idea like one person, one vote takes our country 250 years to evolve on. So recognize that the stakes we're up against, things are going to move slowly. And against a compelling idea like one person, one vote, the nonprofit governance or charter idea has actually made tremendous progress in its first 20 years. And so if it can take off and grow faster than democracy, I'm okay with that, and we will persevere ahead. So that's the serious part. That's the citizen part of the talk. And now I get to turn to Netflix. So in Netflix, we went public at a current split-adjusted price of $1 about 18 years ago, and now we're at $350. So remember, the big money is made after you go public. All of you that obsess about going public, it's like losing your virginity. I understand you're obsessed about it. And until you get there, you realize that's just the beginning. Then your life's journey is to learn how to be good at sex. And that's hard. And your life's journey in a company is to be a good and significant public company. It doesn't really begin until you get that initial episode over. I look forward to all of you being public, but once you are, remember, it's just the beginning. Now, I was fortunate to have many early leadership lessons, meaning I hit my head against a wall many times. One of them, I was an engineer in a startup about 30 years ago. It's about a 40-person startup. I was working really hard. I was like coding all night. I was an engineer. I was trying to do back-to-back all-nighters, and I never quite made it through the second one. I would be so proud if I could do an all-nighter and no one could tell in the morning because, I would try to look okay. But the coffee cups would tend to pile up around my desk. It was all open seating. And so by the end of 3 or 4 or 5 days, there was just like a series of coffee cups, and then the janitor would clean them all for me, and I'd come back in, and that would be great. And this went on for 6 months and 8 months, and we were doing some amazing coding. And one day I came in early to work, and I went into the bathroom, and there was my CEO with all of my coffee cups around him, and he was washing them. And my heart dropped because I realized, oh my God. And I said, Barry, have you been washing my coffee cups all year? And he said, yeah. And I said, why? And he said, you do so much for us, and this is the one thing I can do for you. And I was just so moved, and I felt like, wow, I would follow that guy to the ends of the earth. Unfortunately, that's where he led us. I had great personal loyalty. He led essentially the speccing of the product. We built this amazing piece of software. A couple customers bought it. No customer ever installed it. I'd spent 2 years writing stuff that never got turned on. And I realized, this leadership thing, you both have to be like humble and gracious, but you also have to be like strategic. You don't want to be like the blessed leader and you go right into the box canyon and everybody's dead, okay? So there's a couple of these skills. Now, in my first company, which was 1991 to 1997, I had the original idea. It was a software product, a very technical software. Our sales doubled every year. It was very exciting. But I also made a lot of mistakes. I was an engineer, and when you're that way, you think every time there's a mistake, I'm going to put a process in place to avoid that mistake happening again. And basically treating the company like a big semiconductor factory. I'd studied semiconductor yield management, kind of the basic courses, and that was that industrial orientation. And so year by year, we had more processes, and we actually reduced error with all of these processes. And we got to be very efficient. We got to be, everyone followed the manual, so to speak. Some of it was written, some of it was just verbal, but it was very well regimented. And so we were really good until the market shifted. And markets always shift. In this particular case, it was C++ to Java. And the whole value system was around following the playbook. It wasn't around thinking. And of course, there were some thinkers. But in general, we were stuck in our ways, even after only 6 years. And so what I realized, eventually our largest competitor acquired us. It was not a great outcome, but it was a good outcome still. And in hindsight, I realized it's like monoculture. I had tried to over-optimize for a particular thing, and then we had gotten very specialized and very rigid, and that flexibility is at tension with efficiency. And if you really seek efficiency, no errors, crisp execution, no wastage, then you really cramp down on flexibility, adaptability. So when I started Netflix, I realized, okay, the key is not being so narrow. In my first company, we did management by objective. Everybody had very specific objectives. We had bonuses pay out every 6 months, depending on did you meet your objectives or not. Well, the challenge with that is you get partway through a quarter or a year, and you want to shift a little bit because maybe a sales territory or maybe an engineering goal. And everyone's got their MBO set that goes their comp. And so if you change them, you have to renegotiate all the comp. And all these management by objectives become like handcuffs, like concrete, that don't make you flexible. And so I realized in Netflix, let's just try to tap into the human soul. Let's try not to manage, but to inspire. And so to do that, let's be very flexible. So like the comp program, no bonuses. We just have flat comp. Every year it gets adjusted. If you do great work, obviously you get a raise. But we don't try to manage specific details. We try to lead by setting context. For me, the perfect quarter, which I have not yet had, is a quarter when I made no decisions. When all I had to do was talk about these great shows, these important things, this great market, the way Cambodia is developing for us, the way Germany's developing, how to think about pricing, and I never had to make a decision. And this whole idea that the CEO is supposed to be the micromanager or now the nano manager, that leads to very poor long-term outcomes. The key, I think, in leadership is to step back, and when there's a mistake, don't say, here's a process or here's how to fix it, but figure out what context you failed to set as leader such that a smart person could make that mistake. The whole art of modern creative enterprise is around tolerating a bunch of small mistakes so that everybody is learning and thinking. So when the big changes come in the market, you don't have the rigidity. Now, what I'm talking about applies to creative enterprises, like all of yours. If you're running an airline, I want you to have checklists and procedures. If you are running a hospital, there's a number of safety-critical businesses where you want 0 errors. That's a class of the economy. This room is filled with entrepreneurs, and the way that you invent and learn is to build the toleration for errors. And so you want lots of little mistakes, you want learning episodes so that you're adaptable. Now, when we went public back at the $1, we were a $100 million DVD rental company, and Blockbuster was $5 billion, so 50 times larger than us. And so for the next 6 years, we fought a head-to-head battle with them. And finally, thankfully, they declared bankruptcy in 2009. So how did it work that we were able to do that? There was no single thing. We constantly were nimble. We evangelized. Many of the things that happened were not tactics from me. It was all of us thinking about I was always educating people about the customer, what customers cared about, various ideas. And through that process, we learned and evolved. Now, no sooner than Blockbuster had disappeared that we started streaming. YouTube started in 2005. We started in 2007, but it was very nascent. Worked on Windows PCs only with very little content, but started to grow. And eventually, we were able to evolve into doing streaming along with DVD. And then when we expanded internationally, we were able to do just streaming. That started in 2010. And then in 2011, we started expanding into original content with House of Cards. Each of these could have been a mistake, but we had a broad system where people felt willing to try things. In fact, in the House of Cards case, Ted Sarandos, who's been my partner on the content side at Netflix, now for almost 20 years, wanted to do this thing. And he told me about, well, we're going to spend $100 million on this, and it's not going to come out for 2 years, and that's about equal to our entire streaming budget at that time of 2011. I was like, okay, if that's what you think best. And honestly, I didn't see it. He's the one who saw this is an incredibly powerful script. The core Shakespearean themes will resonate, and that if we nail it, that this will define us and then allow us to be, and it was paying more than we wanted to, but that would allow us to attract future talent because Kevin Spacey was doing this, David Fincher was doing this, Robin Wright was doing this with big name talent, validated the platform. Now, he was right about that. There have been other things that I've done, like the famous Quickster split that didn't work, or other things that he's done that hasn't worked. So, we make a lot of small mistakes so that we learn quickly. And now, around the world, we're a majority international company. We have customers everywhere in the world except for China, and we're continuing to progress on that model as we expand globally. Now, some people will tell you, once you go public, you gotta get serious. Once you go public, you gotta grow up. And I would say if you get tight, if you get rigid once you go public, you're gonna go down, okay? And what you really need to do is say, now we've gotta take bigger risks. I was with Jeff Bezos at the Oscars, and I said, so that HQ2 thing didn't work out so well. And he said, well, we'll see over time, but we're a big company. We need to have big failures. We could take a punch in the nose. And I got to get my people to fail big. I was like, that's a good perspective. I like that. Okay, so think about it as naturally as you grow, the organization is going to get conservative. So your role as leader as it grows is to push people to take risk. Their natural position will not be to take risk. You got to make it okay to take risk, and you have to evangelize what are we trying to do in the business so they're taking risks in a smart area. So it's a constant feedback loop. As an example, when we went public, many people say, no more giving out the financials. So on Thursday, I meet with our global top people in a room about this big, about 800 people, and we go through all the financial numbers for the quarter, and we haven't released publicly. And it's never leaked. Okay, so this idea that once you're public, you've got to control all the numbers. I mean, there's some risk of a leak, but it is small compared to the risk of your people not feeling bought into the specialness of the organization and not feeling connected to the information. So when you balance those risks, you realize that there's a good case for being aggressive in information sharing. So we use Google Docs, but there's many systems to use, and enormous amounts of information are open for anybody to read. A complete document on all our strategy choices, documents on the financials. So the curious-minded can just click through and read. We have very few protections. Now, someday, some of it may leak, but what we judge is the damage from such a leak is much less than the damage from compartmentalizing information as you grow. Now we're about 6,000 people around the world, and communication is even more important than it's ever been before. So my takeaway for all of you would be lean into freedom, lean into creativity, think about inspiring rather than supervising or managing, and step by step, loosen your control. Try to make fewer decisions every year. Try to set better context every year. And I think if you do so, you will experience some of what we've experienced, which is great leadership throughout the organization that's flexible, that's aligned, that cares, that's passionate. And those things will help your enterprises grow. And if you all succeed, then education around the world will be great for everyone. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.